Pittsburgh, and I'm here on behalf of the University of Georgia Libraries and the University of Georgia's Georgia Writers Hall of Fame to welcome you to this event and to prompt these two writers into discussion about their work and writing in general. So I'm very pleased that you're here, and I do want to explain that we initially expected to have two additional writers, Bill Williams and Judith Ortiz-Cofer here, but circumstances intervened and they're not able to be with us, and I'm very sorry to have to tell you that. Of course, tomorrow's ceremony will induct these two writers, Melissa Fay Green and Natasha Trethewey, into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, along with James P. Kilgo and Johnny Mercer. That ceremony will be at 10 o'clock here in the library in the 4th floor rotunda. Everybody is invited. Please plan to attend. We would love to have you there. I would like to thank the staff of the University of Georgia Libraries for hosting these events, for hosting the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and they've done a wonderful job. The Hall of Fame is soon to move into the new Special Collections building. That move will begin later this year, and next year's ceremonies will take place entirely in that new building. We're looking forward to it. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame is a wonderful resource for the university and for the state of Georgia, and it's always great to have another event related to the Hall of Fame. I'd like to introduce today's two writers who are going to talk to each other and to you about Georgia writing and writing in general. First of all, Melissa Fay Green on my left, your far right, on my right. They didn't teach me that in school. Melissa Fay Green is a renowned journalist and writer known for her creative nonfiction on Georgia personalities and historical events, as well as on people and events from other parts of the nation and the world. She was born in Macon and moved with her family to Ohio when she was still a child. She received her BA at Oberlin and moved back to Georgia in 1975, where she took a job with Georgia Legal Services. She's lived in Athens, Rome, and Atlanta. She lives in Atlanta now. She's the author of 4 books: Praying for Sheetrock, The Temple Bombing, Last Man Out, and There Is No Me Without You, One Woman's Odyssey to Save Her Country's Children. And she also has a new book, No Biking in the House Without a Helmet, that will be published in April. She's won a number of awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, the Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize, the Georgia Author Award, the Southern Book Critics Circle Award, and the ACLU National Civil Liberties Award. I'm also pleased to introduce Natasha Trethewey, who's a very well-known contemporary American poet, especially recognized for her reflections on race, historical erasure, family, memory, and the working class. Natasha Trethewey received her BA in English from the University of Georgia in 1989 and became UGA's first graduate outside of journalism to win the Pulitzer Prize in 2007. She holds an MA in English and Creative Writing from Collins University and an MFA in Poetry from the University of Massachusetts. She's currently the Phyllis Wheatley Distinguished Chair in Poetry at Emory University. Her books include 3 poetry collections: Native Guard, Balak's Ophelia, Domestic Work, and a recent nonfiction book, Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf. Her awards, in addition to the Pulitzer, include the Cave Canem Poetry Prize, 2 Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters book prizes, and the Lillian Smith award for poetry. So I thought we could get things going this afternoon by asking each of these writers to talk about how they would describe themselves as writers in today's world. And either one of you can start.
Well, when you're speaking to younger people, you need to emphasize it involves this product called paper. Rarely seen. Sometimes it's bound into an object, formerly known as a book, that could be conveniently carried places, and you know, you could mark your place and stack it up by your night table. I think, I don't know if I would guess Natasha feels sort of the same way. One feels kind of under bombardment, but I think writers probably have, since probably pretty early in the 20th century, by so many distractions and so many other entertainments available to readers, to people who want to have a moment of leisure time. I know Saul Bellow wrote a lot about this in the middle of the 20th century, the incredible distractions and how the demands Saul Bellow described the imagination as being kind of like the Oklahoma land rush, and that big concerns, big corporations, everyone wants a part of consciousness, which is like the new land rush, and wants the public's consciousness. And so people, citizens, are targeted by you know, every kind of media, and Hollywood, and BlackBerry, and Twitter, and Facebook, and there's so many demands. And what we want is for people to give over a little more time, a longer time than it takes to write a Twitter or a Facebook entry. And one thing that Saul Bellow wrote that I agree with so much is how, in fact, we long to be asked to give our attention. We long to give it, you know, but you have to turn off everything else. And I think still the role of writers and of readers is so important, to be able to share sustained consciousness and sustained contemplation of a subject. Everything isn't comprehensible like that in quick sound bites. So I take the role very seriously, not only the role of a writer, but the role of a reader too, and to give over my attention to a novelist or a nonfiction writer or a poet.
You know, Melissa, it used to be so difficult to think of myself as a writer, especially when I got on airplanes, because if you answer that question by saying, I used to say I was a poet, and you know, people would either look at me like I was insane or pull out a journal and want to show me all the poems they'd been writing, or that their 12-year-old daughter had written. So now that I've actually written a book of prose, maybe I can say I'm a writer, and it'll be a little bit better than having to say that I'm a poet. I often start by saying I'm a professor, and then if they still seem interested, I'll work up to finally saying, well, actually, I write. One of the things that I find about it, however, is that what has stayed constant for me, since I was a very little girl and my father kept telling me, you have to be a writer because you have something important to say. Now that's not a thing that a lot of poetry teachers would tell students. There's a little adage about how if a student comes to you and says they want to be a writer because they have something important to say, you discourage that person. But if someone says they want to be a writer because they like playing around with words, well, that's who you encourage. And yet my father, who was also a poet and an English professor, began saying to me as a child that I had to do it because I had something important to say. So he was really setting me up to fail in a lot of ways. And yet, being a writer means figuring out how to say it such that someone else would want to listen to it. I do feel like the poet's job, the writer's job, is to record the cultural and historical moment in which we live. I think that the language of poetry is the best way that we have to reach not only the intellect, but also the heart. And so no matter what I'm writing about, I always see myself as someone who is trying to ennoble not only myself, but my readers. Very much like George Orwell talked about in his 1949 essay, Why I Write, in which he says that one of his most significant purposes is to try to push the world in the direction that you'd like to see it go in. And the hope is that that's a better direction than it's been in so far. One, more humane, more just, more empathetic. I think that's my job.
If students or younger writers come to you and ask for advice of any sort, what kind of advice can you give?
I tell them to read the writers that they love and admire and let them be their teachers. And I tell them to fall in love with the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, because every word is a poem. And that by learning to love words that way and to learn from the great works that will be our teachers is the way to start you on the path.
I also tell young people, or anyone who wants to be a writer, to read. You have to read in order to write. You have to know what has been done, what's been created. I was inspired as a young writer by Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading, in which he sets out his standards. Not saying that they should be everyone's standards, but these are his standards. And he says, well, you can't possibly write about love unless you've read the way love was written about more beautifully than ever before, which was in 12th century Italy. If you don't know that, don't dare write about love. This is how things have been done beautifully. I also find it's a funny thing, and I bet it's true of poets too, that that writers, people want to be invited aboard. Like, I remember as a young writer, I only wanted to write. I always wanted to write from a really young age. It's all I ever imagined doing was being a writer. And yet, when I was in my early 20s, I started corresponding, started writing letters to an established writer, a nonfiction author named John Baskin, and I was going to greater and greater lengths with these letters, and it was the era of the typewriter and the correction tape and so on, and I was using all of those even in these letters, and pouring more and more beautiful prose into these letters. Some of those stuff from those letters ended up going into my book years later, Praying for Sheetrock. I believe that I said that, what was it, the palm trees, something, the palm trees were hysterical with light. I don't know, there was some foliage was hysterical with light, I described in this letter, and kept sending him these letters, and finally, he said what I was unconsciously waiting for. He said, I didn't even know I was waiting for it, and I didn't even know I was lobbying for it, but he finally said, you know, these are pretty good, maybe you should write something. And I just thought, yes, I'm in, you know, it's like this small island, and now he said, come on, here's the gangplank, you can come. And I've been aware of it so often over the years, especially when young writers will come to see me. Can I buy you coffee? Can I stop by? You know, and sometimes it's like, I don't, you know, all right, we've got half an hour, what? You go to, and then I'll say, okay, yes, you can write, okay? Good, we good? Go. And they're really happy because a writer said they could write.
You get to it very quickly, but
Yeah.
you make them wait, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's true, that there's, you know, I like also to try to demystify what it means to be a writer. And because I teach creative writing, I want to encourage my students by letting them know that there are, if you have the kind of passion that's going to carry you forward and make you want to do it, there's some things that you can also learn. You know, people argue all the time about whether or not, you know, you can really teach writing poetry. I think you can certainly teach the craft of poetry. There's some things about it that anyone can learn that will make anyone a better writer. And I think most of us would like to be a better writer than we are. And being told that there's no barrier to keeping us from doing that is really important. It was important to me to get that invitation.
Do you find also, sometimes you have to tell students, well, just write. You know, people will say, want to be a writer, and you'll say, well, what are you writing? Well, you know, nothing. You just have to actually write. It's not, you know, a verb.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask a couple of questions about demystification. One is exactly what kind of routine do you have as a writer? How do you manage to write along with everything else that you do?
Coffee for me. And for many of the books, it was the most basic industrial generic, even industrial-sized Maxwell House. It was just Maxwell House. I wrote all the books on Maxwell House. And then I thought, wow, I'm having such nice professional success with Maxwell House. What couldn't I do with some more exotic, something I ground, you know, myself? And so I started going to the Rainbow Natural Foods Grocery in Atlanta, and I brought home beans and ground them. And I remember I had a week where everything just went white. Everything in my mind just went white. And at the moment in my coffee drinking, where usually adjectives start coming into play, it was just white. There was nothing. And by about Wednesday of that week, I went upstairs and just laid face down on my bed. It was like, the career is over, you know? And then Friday I thought, it's the coffee. That's what it was. It was the coffee.
Are you back on that?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know, I'd like to say that the process of writing for me is always the same, that I'm able to create in my life the same kind of time and the same kind of space and the same rituals, but that's not always the case, because I do travel so much and meet students so much and serve on committees and all those other sorts of things that we have to do. When things are settled down, and that's generally in the summer, or if I happen to be on leave, I can keep a kind of regular schedule that involves getting up and drinking some coffee, but not too much for me. I think I would get jittery and kind of crazy. Although I should try it, see what
I don't strike you as jittery.
The coffee would do it. But I think that the thing that I can say that it's always a ritual, no matter where I am, or what kind of time I have, even if I'm sitting in an airport. Writing for me always begins with reading. I can't sit down to write poems without first reading some poems that I love, or new poems that I've just encountered that put the rhythm of someone else's thinking in my mind, such that whatever comes out of me becomes a conversation that I'm having with what I've been reading.
I should add that's true for me too.
Yeah.
It is absolutely true. And what I read every day with the coffee is poetry, and you're on my shelf, and it's the lowest shelf. It's the shelf I can reach from where I'm sitting, and I always read poetry first. When I was writing Praying for Sheetrock, I was reading Homer and read Homer every day. And at some point, I realized in an early draft of Praying for Sheetrock that everyone was gray-eyed. The black people, the white people, everyone was gray-eyed in McIntosh County in that early draft. But from reading Homer. But it's the same for me, just reading the most beautiful literature, the best, absolutely the best literature, even reading literature, you know, slightly over my head, poetry that's too hard to understand, but I find it's just so stirring, even seeing those combinations of words.
Are there other subjects that might prompt you into writing a poem or a story or a book, current events?
Well, I read a lot of history, but because I write about history a lot, so I'm frequently pulling on the shelf that I have of books that I'm somehow using to work on whatever I'm working on at the time. We'll have everything from history, art history, sometimes a little philosophy. I do find that reading lots of different things will help me find a different way to enter a poem. Some other little luminous detail that allows me to start down a path I hadn't intended, which always means I'll end up somewhere that I didn't expect.
You know, Natasha and I have both been guests of a professor at Emory who studies creativity, and both separately we've entered into conversations with students about creativity, and I know one thing that interested this professor was my telling him that just as I go about my day, I pose little questions to myself, little problems to myself. For example, you know, if I were just sitting here, I might try to imagine, before I touched it, what this wooden table would feel like, and whether it's cool or warm. Is it rough? It looks rough, but maybe it's smooth. And I would try to imagine what it would feel like and how I would describe it, and then I'll feel that it's actually warmer and smoother than I imagined. I was, you know, but just to kind of test perception. I walk every day, and so sometimes, often, I'll set myself a problem of describing something. If I wanted to, you know, whatever, you know, capture these, like, just capture something, how would you say it? I read years ago that the great French novelist Balzac helped teach the French short story writer de Maupassant how to write. I don't know if this is true or not, but it was said that Balzac would say to Maupassant, you know, when you go on your walk and come back, I want you to describe to me a landlady that you saw, or a cat, or a milkman, and describe it in such a way that when I followed your steps, I'll know precisely it was that landlady you described and not another. You know, you want to be able to capture it. So, you know, recently I was on a walk and was walking along a hill just full of vines. It was just someone's front yard covered with vines, and I thought, and it's a way of making yourself look at a thing, because later when you're sitting at your desk, you don't have the vines in front of you, so how, you know, just asking myself, how would you capture that? And it struck me that the vines, they had all turned up to capture the sun, they were all turned in the same way, and just in that a kind of unthinking sort of moment, they looked to me like just a hall full of waiters carrying and all coming in with the platters, you know, to serve in a big ballroom. A few of my younger children are athletes. All my younger children are athletes. All my younger children are children by adoption. And they're really great athletes, whereas none of our biological children. Is this being taped? Some of our biological children are excellent athletes too, in case this is being taped. My new book, which is about the kids, I have a chapter in it called The Jewish Guide to Raising Star Athletes, and it involves adopting children from Ethiopia. But the kids, the athletes among them, there's a tennis book called The Inner Guide to Tennis. None of them play tennis, but that book, The Inner Guide to Tennis, talks about self-one and self-two. Self-one being, and it works with everything, and it absolutely works with writing. Self-one being the person you are intersecting with the world, and wondering what people think of you, and how do I look, and will I make this next point, and am I going to be a star? And self-two, just doing the act, the tennis, the poetry, the writing, whatever it is, out of pure love, out of pure intensity. And so, for me, and I'm sure for both of us, you know, the reading the most beautiful literature, for me, the coffee, is about reaching self-two, and reaching that level of pure intensity where reviewers be damned, I don't know if I'll find a publisher, anything, it's just you're doing it for the love of the art.
You both, in different ways, write about subjects that have a bearing on history. Sometimes history is a part of what you write about. Exactly what do you feel your relationship is to history, and how does it come out in the work?
Well, I think about one of the things that the poet Robert Hayden said. Robert Hayden, the first African-American poet who was a consultant to the Library of Congress, said that he wrote because he wanted to correct a lot of the misconceptions about African-American history. And in many ways, I do the same thing, because I'm writing to fill in the gaps and the erasures, those things that have often been left out of historical accounts, things that are willfully forgotten or neglected. I've been interested in making sense of what I've been given that has left out so much of the history that would, I think, be meaningful to all of us if we reckoned with it. That's the thing I'm always trying to do.
So my approach is very different, since I'm a nonfiction writer. And for me, it's a problem of balancing real accuracy with my perceptions and my ability to describe it. So I've often interviewed people and tried to capture their story. What I do, which I know is unusual for some journalists, but I really believe in it, after I've interviewed someone and have kind of boiled down the interview, boiled down the transcript, here's the material I'm going to go with, I give the material to the person I interviewed to say, have I got this right? Is this accurate? because I'd rather fix it then than here after publication that I've misunderstood. When I was interviewing people in McIntosh County, some were pretty hostile witnesses. There were people in the black community were very open about the shenanigans that had gone on down there, but people in the white community were more reserved about it. And so as I started to try to interview people in the white community, I would say to people, I can't promise that you'll love the book, but I promise I won't twist your words. Anything you tell me, I'm going to try to put it in an accurate context. I'm going to check it with you, and if I've got it wrong, you'll tell me. And even if I have it so wrong you don't want your name in the book, I'll take your name out of the book. And it was a practice I started then with that book, and I've done it all the way through. Let's get it right. When I was in high school, I was misquoted by the Dayton Daily News. And it was a little thing. It was a sort of slip of the pen for the Dayton Daily News, but it was a really big deal in my life, and I was blackballed from National Honor Society, and which I thought was great because I thought it was a blow against the Vietnam War, because somehow the National Honor Society was for the war, and blackball was against the war. It was a strange time, as you remember. Nevertheless, it caused some degree of havoc in my life for a while, and it wasn't anything I had said. I was misquoted in the newspaper, and it was really an early warning signal to me of the power of words and my power when I'm writing nonfiction, my power to distort a person's voice, a person's deeds by getting it wrong. So I've really have tried to be very careful and be accurate in the way that I treat real lives.
Well, I should just say, I hate being misquoted too, but I hate even more being misunderstood. So let me just say, in case this was confusing, I'm also interested in historical accuracy. I mean, that's actually the point, trying to correct the inaccuracies in history, the things that are inaccurate because they haven't told a whole story. I don't want to be historically anachronistic, either in my poems or in nonfiction. And so I do poetry that requires a lot of research. Even if I'm creating an invented character, and I do believe in the possibilities of borrowing across the line, fiction as history, history as fiction, the way that the practitioners have to use a little bit of what each other does, the kind of speculation to get at a larger truth that might be invisible to us because of the historical record. But even though I'm making it up, I'm hoping that what I'm saying is true.
So both those answers involve responsibility. Responsibility to history, responsibility to people you've interviewed in one form or the other. What is a writer's responsibility in general? Or what would you say your responsibility is in general, beyond those answers that you just gave?
I think probably what's similar about us is wanting to give voice to people whose voices haven't been heard historically. I think that we're similar in that way. And in all my books, I've found kind of a single episode, a single, one small place or one small aspect of a story in order to illuminate the larger story. But the people I tend to interview are not the newsmakers, the headline grabbers, and you similarly have gone across history to find people who, they weren't the ones interviewed, they weren't the ones that would have been invited on Larry King, but their voices are incredibly vital. So I think probably we're sort of similar in that way.
I think so too, and I was thinking when you were talking about how you would hand the piece over to someone and say, did I get this right? What you owe to the people that you're writing about, especially the people who are still here, is a big deal. And I really encountered that in writing my book of nonfiction, because the people I was talking about, a lot of them were my own family. And I was just on a panel about this at the AWP convention, and at some point, I was the one who brought up the idea of the ethics that go with it, what you're talking about. Wanting to represent people in a way that is satisfying to them, that they feel like it's accurate. But also feeling at the same time, because I was revealing things about people in my own family, I felt like I had to that I had other people who were doing this documentary project with me. And so I was inviting them in many ways to get to talk to my family, a radio producer here, you know, somebody else there. And my family trusted me. And they would say, you know, my cousin would always say to me, okay, just make sure I look good, you know? And I know that that's some of the things that some of the other panelists that I was with experienced. That they were able to gain the people's trust, and so the people would sort of open up their lives to them. And if you do that, you do have a responsibility to not simply make use of people for your own purposes. It was very difficult for me, but I felt very protective of the people who allowed me to tell their story.
One of my difficult relationships in that way was when I was writing the book, The Temple Bombing. The hero of that book was Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, whose synagogue on Peachtree Street in Atlanta was bombed in 1958 as part of the violent backlash to the civil rights movement. He was deceased, and I spent a lot of time reading his letters and his sermons and interviewing his wife, who was very much alive and still is. So I fell into a pattern of, after I had written some passages about Rabbi Rothschild, I'd mailed them off to Janice Rothschild in Washington to see had I captured him, because I didn't even get to know him. And we fell into this really unfortunate pattern. I'd send off the material, and a couple of days would go by, and then she'd call, and she always started out the same way. It was so depressing. She'd say, Melissa, is this nonfiction? I said, yes. Yes, Janice, this is nonfiction. All right, this is wrong. You know, so I'd try to fix it, and you know, I would do another chapter, I'd send it off, 2 days would go by, she'd call, is this nonfiction? Yes, this is nonfiction, just help me, you know, help me get this right. So I knew that he had first stepped foot in Atlanta, his first time ever in the Deep South. He was from Pittsburgh on a July day in 1946. And I even knew who had picked him up. It was a dentist from the congregation. I was able to research how hot it was that day, and it was really hot, you know, it was a 97-degree scorcher. And I started spending more and more time thinking about that arrival. That was his entry into the Deep South, and it was going to be his first discovery of segregation. He hadn't seen it before. And I you know, pictured what the little Atlanta airport looked like then. It was just like a little brick building out in a cornfield. It wasn't the, you know, the Hartsfield International Airport, you know, non-air conditioned, and what it would have been like for him coming through this hall. In those years, they had an African-American woman dressed as a mammy seated on a bale of hay in front of the airport, welcoming visitors to the South. So I started spending more and more pages on the rabbi's arrival at the Atlanta airport in those years. And finally, by about page, you know, 412, I finally had the man exit the airport. And then, then I had my most lyrical passage, which involved a warm wind coming across the, I can't even remember where it came from. I don't know, the warm wind came off the Atlantic and across 1,000 acres of cropland. That's what it was, and from the sizzling Atlantic beyond or something. So I box all of this up and send these hundreds of pages off to Janice, and I think, I have nailed this. I have finally, we have really done it, you know. But a few days went by, and Janice called, and she said, is this nonfiction? I said, yes. She said, Melissa, he took the train. So then I had to, you know, I still had some of the hot wind in the book, but I had to let it come up and straight and turn right.
When you were telling that, I wanted to tell you, I did not think that's where you were going to say. My first book, Domestic Work, has this sequence of poems that's all about my grandmother and all the different jobs that she held when she was growing up in Mississippi. And I used to listen to all these stories that she told me. And you know, there would just be bits and pieces of it. And so when I sat down finally to write the poems, of course, a lot of it was a kind of invention, you know? Like I'm sure the beautiful writing about, you know, the airport was, I mean, but it was that kind of invention about details, things I couldn't know but had to imagine. But of course I also had to give her a little bit of an interior life that I could piece together from knowing her and thinking about the time and whatever research I could do. But the greatest thing in the world, to me, when I gave it to her, and she read it, she said to me, "It's all true.
Oh.
That's just how it happened." And of course I knew it couldn't have been
Right.
that was how it happened.
Yeah.
But in some ways it's also our job to convince through language. And to find, again, this is a little different, of course, because now I'm just talking about poetry, but how it can be true, emotionally true, even if not all the facts.
That's wonderful. My first book was turned into a play, Praying for Sheetrock, and it reminds me of this. It was in Chicago. The premiere was in Chicago, and a lot of folks came up from McIntosh County to see it. People from both the black and white community, which was amazing, an amazing thing. And the actor who played the hero of the book, the late Thurnell Alston, was a short, round-faced, light-skinned man. Thurnell Alston was a tall, very dark-skinned, angular man. But there was something in his portrayal of Thurnell Alston that afterwards, all the people from McIntosh County came up to me and said, "Oh my God," and he looked just like him.
I want to make sure people in the audience have a chance to ask questions, but I wanted to ask a question. And that is, you're both residents of Georgia, you're Georgia writers, you're being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Certainly, the Georgia writer best known across the world by name is Margaret Mitchell and her novel, Gone with the Wind. And I was wondering, have you read it? When did you read it? What kind of burden or weight does that novel represent for you?
I haven't read it. I saw the movie though. What I will say is that it looms large enough to be a burden whether you've read it or not. I remember my 12th grade history class. And in that history class, I was not asked to read the book, but my professor showed over a course of a few days the movie. And there is a poem in my book, Native Guard, that responds to, I think, some particular characters in the movie, and actually to the representation of Southern history. For me, that's the burden, but it's also a blessing, because without such treatments, there would be nothing for me to push back against.
I'm reminded that I heard years ago that most people coming to Georgia wanted to see two things, the Coca-Cola factory and Tara. And it's sort of it places a burden on all Georgians, I think, not just riders, that we're not still in hoop skirts. That's not the state of race relations. The shadow thrown by Gone with the Wind was thrown also by the premiere of the movie here in 1939, and the segregated ball at the Georgian Terrace. The black actors were not invited from Hollywood, the white actors all came from Hollywood. A story that I had heard about that and thought it's just an amazing story, and I believe that it's true. And I think actually that Gary Pomerantz mentions it in his book Where Peachtree Crosses Sweet Auburn. But the story was that although the ball was segregated, they invited a black church choir to entertain the guests. This was at the ball after the premiere of Gone with the Wind. There may be folks here who know this more accurately, but my understanding was that a black church choir was invited, and they were invited to dress up as if it were the 19th century. So they were asked to dress as slaves in order to sing and entertain, and that there was a young boy there, the son of the pastor, who was dressed, you know, as a pickaninny, as a slave boy, and that the church was Ebenezer Baptist Church, and that the little boy was Martin Luther King, and entertained the segregated crowd that night. But Georgia's come a long way since then.
And in my own defense, let me say, I've spent most of my life in Georgia. I grew up here. I am a Mississippi native, however, and I have read plenty of Faulkner.
Well, I'd like to open it up to everyone here. Would you like to ask any questions, please? direct your questions? Yes.
Not to put you on the spot, I'm going to, what's your favorite library and why? Whoever wants to go first.
That's a nice question. Well, I actually was going to talk tomorrow about the impact of the main library here when I stepped foot into it for the first time, which was just after marrying my husband, Don Samuel. He was in law school here. We were married in Savannah, and I moved here during his second year of law school, so that was 1979. And I had never in my life seen a library like, is it just called the main library? I don't know what you call it now. It's not a digital library, it's got stacks.
The
And
main library is the Isle of Dunlap Little.
it's the little library, which doesn't do it justice. So that was a beloved library to me. And I remember going home one day and saying to Donnie, the amazing thing about it was that any book you read, you could look at all the footnotes of that book and look up those books, and it had all those books. And you could open up those books and go through the footnotes, and it had all those books. And I'd never been in a library where you could go so far down and keep finding the book, the footnotes. So love that library very much. I love the Emory Library, which is walking distance for me. And I love actually little Decatur, Georgia Main Library, which is the one that I use, that I order books through. So I pretty much form attachments to libraries wherever I am.
I think that's the same for me too. I would have said, you know, there's certain libraries I've been to that I like very much, but there, in all libraries, even some of the smallest ones are wonderful to me, because those are the places that, for me, something always happened or something was starting. You know, when I was a very little girl, my father was a graduate student at Tulane University, and so I would spend entire days in the stacks at the Sophie Newcomb Library. I would just grab a book and lie down on the floor. And just the fact that there was a space to do that in was what was thrilling to me. But also the little public library in the city of Gulfport, which is no more. The main branch of the library was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. But I used to go there all the time. It was that kind of place of refuge. But it was also the place that when someone told me about the Native Guards who were stationed off the coast of Gulfport, that's the first place I went to try to find out something about them. And looked until I found somebody's MA thesis that was just shelved away somewhere that had 1 or 2 lines about the Native Guards, and I was hooked. And so I sort of think of that library as the place that got me started on what would be really important discovery for me.
I worked all through high school in a public library in Dayton. That was my job. I was a page and had to put up with my father's humor every single night, and he was promoted to being a chapter yet. Spent 3 years as a page, but I think I was also just taking books and basically lying down on the floor when the hours got long, but just, you know, just reading what I showed. To this day, I know hundreds and hundreds of titles and authors. And I would offer that one of the greatest breakthroughs in library science in recent decades is not, in fact, the digitalization of collections, but the fact that now in the picture book sections, there can be a bin for the letter A, because we were still filing the children's picture books, the skinny little picture books in alphabetical order by author, but now you can just see if it's an A author. Just put it in the bin.
We had a question in the back.
Yes. I wonder if you would care to discuss the relationship that you have with writer friends. I think it's probably an important relationship.
It's a very nice question. Sometimes I think, and I don't know if you share this, I think maybe poets are pretty scattered, but sometimes I feel really lucky living in Atlanta and not New York, because one isn't a dime a dozen, you know? And I just think if we lived in New York and we were a writer married to a lawyer, you know, who isn't? But in my neighborhood, it's pretty cool that I'm a writer. Like, people think that's really great. My closest writer friend is a nonfiction writer named Alex Kotlowitz, who lives in Chicago. He wrote a book, There Are No Children Here, about the big housing projects in Chicago. We share an agent. Our agent had this dream that his stable of writers, which is, I believe, how he put it, that we should all get to know one another and support one another. And in the case of me and Alex, it worked a lot. And so we, you know, we share work, we edit each other's work, really purely from sort of self too. There's no sort of egoic jealousy, not wanting the other to get ahead, really rooting for the other. I had nice relationships with a few writers like that, actually, of trying to really help and support one another. So it's it's a wonderful thing. My main reader is my husband, and it's good news and bad news. The bad news is the only thing he ever reads are law reports. I mean, the only nonfiction he ever reads are Supreme Court justices. So then I trust him with my literary nonfiction, and if he says, you know, boring or something, I'm like, all right, do I trust that? You know, if he says great, I totally trust it. But if he doesn't like it, you know. And the other thing that's both good and bad is that he's honest. He's always honest. And tell me if this is true for you too. For me, there are two different stages. When you're first trying to nurture a piece of writing, and it's really fragile, and you feel fragile about it, and you're going to let someone see it, the person damn well better love it.
Yeah.
You know, all you want at that moment is, it's fabulous, keep going. You know, it's not the moment for, you know, it's not the best. And so, even after 32 years of marriage, my husband can't always tell when I'm in that moment that I just really want him to say it's great, keep going. He'll say, no, you know.
Well, you know, my husband is my first and generally only reader too, and he's a historian, so I trust him immensely as a reader of my poems and my prose, because he's very honest about things too. I mean, one of the things that he always says, I mean, I know that it's working if he says, yeah, I can see it. You know, that the imagery has done something that makes him see it. But if he can't see it, then I know it's, you know, time to go back to the drawing board. But what I like about my relationships with other writers is that there are writer friends that I have now that I first encountered through their writing, and I came to admire their work a great deal. And then I get to meet them and also become friends with them. And so, you know, it's a different kind of relationship because I may not necessarily be sending them a manuscript to look at, but their poems are always teaching me something. And then we have these conversations about work and what's meaningful to us. And it's nice to know that there are other people that are constantly experiencing the same kinds of trials and ups and downs and joys. And that you're not alone doing that.
I'm Facebook friends with a bunch of writers now, which just gets sort of weird. So writers, right, so I've read their novels and now I'm seeing pictures of their new niece. In fact, on Facebook, I really joined Facebook so I could connect with my kids in that way, and it does sort of work. So the other day a friend of mine posted a video from the David Letterman show about just stupid dog tricks, and it was absolutely hilarious. It was this really eager-looking beagle, and it was the young man who owned it said, "Play dead," and he went like this, and he says, "Okay," and he got up, and then he said, "Play dead," and it was really funny. And so I forwarded it to my children, and it was my daughter Molly, who pointed out that the person who had sent it to me was, now I'm going to blank on his name. He's a poetry emeritus professor at Oberlin. What? I'm blanking on his name. I'll come back to that. I completely blew that punchline. He's an award-winning, important American poet, and he posted the dead dog David Letterman show trick.
We had a question.
I just wondered what your feelings were about having your work on Kindle and other technology devices for reading. If you had any impact, if it had any impact on your work, or what you felt, either of you, about having it on Kindle.
I still picture paper when I'm writing, and I love paper, and I don't think that I'll move over to that, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I do have an iPad, and I take it on the plane and I read on it, just because if I'm traveling, it's easier than carrying a bunch of books. But so far, the Kindles or the iPad, I've seen, someone showed me one of my books, book of poetry on there, and it's not it's not my poems anymore. I mean, if it were a page of prose, I guess that'd be fine, but the line breaks aren't the same.
They get that wrong?
Yeah, I think in order to, they don't just do a Xerox, you know, a facsimile of the page. I think if you shrunk it down enough somehow, you could see it. But I think the way most people read it, it just looks like lines of prose. And so without line breaks, it's not the poem anymore. So for me, it's, you know, if they could make the poems appear as they appear, you know, on a page in the book, then that'd be fine. I would understand why people don't want to carry a bunch of things if they're going on a trip or something. But I'm still also like you. I want to hold books, you know.
The poet's David Young. David Young.
Yes.
The poet David Young. Dead dog and tricks. Also, the trouble with Kindle is you can't have the experience of being in an airport and seeing that someone's reading your book, you know? I've actually never had that experience. But I really hope to. Yeah, it'll probably never happen.
But it also is good for me because if I'm sort of reading a trashy murder mystery, no one knows.
No one will know.
We have a question then? Yes, sir.
Miss Trethaway, I read a poem of yours, I forget the title, but it was a scene where someone is standing on a dock or a wharf on the Mississippi coast looking at a shrimp boat or some such. And it may be my lack of perception, but I don't recall that there was a message or an underlying meaning to it. So I'm wondering, is your poetry mostly concrete depiction, or do you go for meaning? Recently I read where some article writer remarked that T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound forced meaning into their poetry. I'm not sure what this means, but do you perhaps attempt to force meaning into your poetry?
I think words do that, since they have meanings, and we could look them up in the dictionary. I would first say that you probably should read that poem again. It makes me think that maybe either you didn't read it very closely or not enough to understand it. Poetry is the way that we have, perhaps the one way that we have, of saying what we mean, but meaning something else too. So the poem means what it says, but it also means something else. And a close reader can find that. It might mean taking out your dictionary and thinking about the different levels of meaning in a single word, the possibilities of figurative language to make the mind leap to a new apprehension of things. But a reader has to be that kind of reader. If a reader only reads for the literal, then that's all that the reader is going to find. So there's two levels of reading that one must do to read a poem. And it is literally what it says, but figuratively what else it says.
What's the name of that poem, do you know? I bet we'd all like to go try
Oh,
it out.
it's Theories of Time and Space.
Couple of questions, yes.
Hi, I have a question for each of you regarding process. We both talked about reading first and writing almost in conversation. I think you put it, Natasha, with what you've read. And I'm wondering if, for you, Natasha, if writing nonfiction was different, your process was different than your process for writing poetry, and specifically if you felt constrained by the freedoms to go to invention as you can do more readily with poetry. And for you, Melissa, I wondered if you could address the question of, your work, as you noted, involves a lot of research, reporting, journalistic kind of reporting, interviews, and that sort of thing. So if you could talk about how you integrate the reporting with the writing. What's your process there? Do you write at the same time as you're reporting, or do you do those as separate processes?
You know, I think that the process of writing the book of prose was very similar in ways for me to how I write my poetry. And I would begin by saying that the the first part of the book began as a series of lectures that I was doing at the University of Virginia that later on were published in the Virginia Quarterly Review. But the editor of that magazine, who asked me to do those lectures, when he proposed the work to me, said, here's what you need to do. I want you to go down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and look around, check out the situation, and then write these lectures the same way that you write your poems. And actually, because he told me that, I wasn't as afraid to embark on this project, this thing that I'd never done before. And I did find that thinking about the way that I write my poems, even the way that I put together an entire collection of poems, you know, Frost talked about the 35th poem is the whole book. Because I was already doing that in books of poems, it was a little bit easier to think about this work of prose as a whole thing that I knew I was writing toward. And so even the movement within that book looks to me like the way that my poems individually and as a whole work, that there's a lot of sort of circling back to certain things. I'm always trying to undermine my own sort of linear sensibilities by doing something that's a little bit more lyrical, a little bit more circling back. And I found that writing the prose book was indeed doing that kind of thing in the way that the poems does. It was hard though, because it was longer. You know, I am used to trying to write these things that are much more self-contained and smaller. So I had to think of things in small pieces like that as well.
So I'll answer about process, and then we're probably nearing the end of the time, right? When I interview someone to capture an event within that person's memory, but something that I didn't see, as I interview the person, I'll allow the scene to start to build in my imagination, and then I'll interview other people with a perception of the same event, something else I didn't see, but maybe many people saw. And with each person I interview, I perfect the scene in my own mind. I keep changing. All right, so it wasn't spring, it was summer. It was a two-story building, not a, and keep changing it to try to understand it. So then in subsequent interviews, I can say, it was a really hot day, right? And the sun was sort of, so that when I'm ready to write, then I'm working from that scene that I've tried to build in my mind from the eyewitnesses. The other thing is, usually when I'm interviewing someone, and I'll have the tape recorder there between us. The tape recorder works in a couple of ways. It records the voice, but it also puts the person on notice that I'm recording the voice. Actually, the first white person I interviewed in McIntosh County taped me taping him, because he didn't trust my tape recorder. He pulled out a big old reel-to-reel tape recorder, taping my little cassette tape recorder. But I'll sit and take notes at the same time, and if there's something really key, and I don't want it to be a disaster because the tape has failed, I'll write down that. But often I'm sitting there, and it looks like I'm taking notes, but in fact, in addition to taking notes, I'll be describing the person. I'll be getting, the dark brown eyes, and I'll be getting the room. I'll glance around, get what the room is and what's on the wall, and so on at the same time, so that later when I go back to write, I've got images to work from.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I want to thank Natasha Trethewey and Melissa Fay Green for a wonderful conversation, and would like to thank all of you for being here. So we hope that you'll come to the induction ceremony tomorrow at 10 in the 4th floor rotunda of the Miller Learning Center, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.